What's up, everybody? Jack here with the Big and Bold College Football Show. It is a beautiful rainy day here, and I have a lot to unpack. It's going to be a little different this week from in previous weeks, where what I'd liked to do was drop one episode going over the news and then overview the games that happened the previous weekend. Well, with so much news to unpack, that's a little hard to do. So what I'm going to do instead is deliver the news, deliver some of the big things going on headlining college football right now, and give you my take and I think all the important information you need. After that, I'm going to have a separate shorter video where I discuss the biggest games of the week. So the agenda for today is going to be a recent move made by a large program at the head coaching position. Going to talk about some conference realignment that happened for the Big 12, as I'm sure you know. And then I'm going to go over some of the surprises from last weekend's games. So tomorrow or the next day, so that'll be Wednesday or Thursday, check out my next episode talking about the biggest games from the previous weekend. So that should only be 3 or 4 games. It'll be a shorter video. And then the day after that, you'll be able to check out my preview for the upcoming weekend. So I have a lot of content coming at you guys. 3 episodes this week, just dedicated to all the craziness going on in college football right now. So if you want to get caught up on that, give it a listen. Enough of the intro though, because like I said, I got a lot to unpack. Then I got to start up on the next episode for you guys to overview what happened last weekend in the biggest games on Saturday. So with that, first piece of news, some very significant news for a very big program. USC has fired head coach Clay Helton. Now, this obviously comes off the heels of a loss to Stanford, and I'll talk about that later on in the episode, but some consider it abrupt or surprising. But if you've been following the USC situation, you know this isn't much of a surprise. For the last few years, Clay Helton's been on the hot seat, and I talked about that in one of my Patreon episodes, where he is probably on the hottest seat of all coaches in college football. And I'm going to break down really quickly why before we get into candidates to replace him. He starts off at USC, coaches them up to a bowl game win in 2013, nothing too significant. He actually got to USC back in 2010. He was their quarterback coach there. Before that, he spent some time at Memphis, Houston, Duke. But he's mainly an offensive coach, taking over as offensive coordinator and quarterback coach. Interim head coach in 2015 when they fired Steve Sarkisian partway through the year. And he coaches them to a 5-4 season with a loss in the Holiday Bowl. So his first real year as head coach at USC is 2016. And that's really what we're going to focus on. They go 10-3, a bit of a disappointing start to the season. They actually start off 1-3 on the year. That's really when the program thought, yeah, this guy's probably not it for us. He didn't flash early on when he took over, and he has a real rough start to the year. Granted, that's losing to a first-ranked Alabama team, 7th-ranked Stanford team, 24th-ranked Utah team. 2 of those on the road and the other on a neutral field. They end up ripping off 9 wins in a row, including 4th-ranked Washington on the road, and in an incredible game with a fantastic performance by Sam Darnold, they beat a Saquon Barkley-led Penn State 52-49. Amazing Rose Bowl back in 2016. Then the next year they go 11-3, but they lose the Cotton Bowl to Ohio State. Biggest positive on the season is they beat Stanford to win a Pac-12 title. So overall it was a good year. You have a 10-3 season, 11-3 season. You won a Rose Bowl, finished 3rd in the AP poll, brought home a Pac-12 title. There's a lot to like there. Then following the departure of guys like Sam Darnold and Ronald Jones, they go 5-7, and the following year 8-5. At that point, they were thinking, we want to move on from Clay Helton. But they give him 2020 because they don't want to move on from their head coach in a COVID year, right? So they said, hey, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. We'll give you one more season to try and rebound, get you back to where we were, get us back to where we were a couple years ago. Rips off 5 wins in a row. Granted, none against a top 25 team. All Pac-12 opponents in their condensed schedule because of COVID. And the one game that I think cost Clay Helton his job, not the Stanford game. I understand that's what caused him to be fired. But that to me is dropping the feather onto the reason why that's what tipped it overboard for him. Losing to Oregon in the Pac-12 championship game in 2020, I think is what cost him his job ultimately. Because let's say they win that game and they're 6-0 in 2020. They win a Pac-12 title. And then they lose to Stanford the other day. Well, he says, hey, I've brought 2 Pac-12 titles and a Rose Bowl victory to USC. How can you fire me from there? We're still figuring things out. We're a program in transition. And I think that, that's enough to argue that he should stay around. But you're talking about 4 years, 4 seasons since USC has been a really competitive program. Those 5 wins last year don't matter if they lose the Pac-12 title game, which they did. So ultimately, Clay Helton's fired. Time to move on and find a new head coach. I've got 4 candidates that I think are the most likely option to take over for him. There are, of course, some names getting thrown out there, lists of 15 guys to replace Clay Helton. If I threw 15 darts on a map, I'm sure I'd get them pretty close to who they might hire. But I've got 4 who I really like for the job, and I've got some positives and negatives for all of them. I'm going to start with the best candidate, and that's James Franklin, Penn State head coach. Rumors started between a year to 2 years ago about him possibly going to the USC job. But he's done a phenomenal job at Penn State. He even did a good job at Vanderbilt. He had them winning 9 games a season and finishing in the top 25, winning bowl games at Vanderbilt of all places. Comes to Penn State when they're in the middle of scandal, and he has to lead the way for that program. And he gets them to an 11-win team. Back in 2016, they won 11 games, lost an incredible Rose Bowl to USC. I was talking about that when discussing Clay Helton's situation. And they finished as a top 10 team. And then he does it again in 2017, and they win a Fiesta Bowl. Again in 2019, and they win a Cotton Bowl, finish in the top 10. He's got a win on Ohio State. He's got a Big Ten title. He's done everything he can really do for Penn State, with the exception of make the playoff. He's clearly a good recruiter. Not great, but I think it can be hard to recruit talent to Happy Valley. It's kind of an isolated program there in Pennsylvania. And then you have some juggernauts like Ohio State. Michigan's great at recruiting talent. South Carolina, Clemson's not too far away there. But ultimately, really like what you have there in James Franklin. And he's offensive-minded, which I think is what USC really wants, is an offensive-minded head coach. They're not trying to chase their tail going from offensive-minded Clay Helton and then flip the switch and go to, say, a defensive coach. I just don't know if that would really benefit their program. Now with that, next up on the line, so obviously you had the uber successful James Franklin going 62-28 with the program. No playoff victories, but he essentially has the best resume you could ask for if you're USC. Next up, I got Luke Fickell. Now reports have come out that it's Luke Fickell's job to turn down. If he wants it, he'll get it. And you can understand that. He has ties to the Ohio State program. He's from Columbus, Ohio, so Ohio runs in this guy's freaking veins. Spent time there as a linebacker coach, co-defensive coordinator, interim head coach in 2011. He coached them to a 6-7 season. It was a difficult situation in 2011 for him to take over. Then he jumps to Cincinnati and goes 4-8. So I'm not going to fault him for that 1 year in Ohio State and his first year in Cincinnati. After that, you have an 11-2 2018 and 11-3 2019. Finishing in the top 25. 9-1 season last year where they almost beat Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. They only lost that game by a field goal. He's turned Cincinnati into a very strong defensive school. Marcus Freeman, former defensive coordinator, has left. They did a fantastic job with the defense. And the offense is really cooking up with a dynamic playmaker at quarterback. Now with that, I like Luke Fickell. He's a very strong candidate. It's really hard to impress at Cincinnati. That's a difficult program to succeed with. But he's doing it. The problem I have with Luke Fickell, by my count, since 2018, he's 4-5 against top 25 opponents. 3 of those wins came in 2020 alone, and that was against Army, Tulsa, and SMU when they were in the top 25 last year. And I've said before, and some people don't like it, but not all top 25 teams are the same. You know what I mean? Generally speaking, I would say a top 25 Penn State or Michigan or Oregon is different than a top 25 Army or Tulsa. It just is the way it is, usually. Not every year, but usually. And those are 3 programs that aren't typically in the top 25 anyway. But last year was an exception. Now again, it's Cincinnati. They don't recruit top-end talent or bring in the best coaching staffs. So what he's doing with what he has is great. He goes to a juggernaut like USC with the money, the recruiting that they have. He can do a lot of good things. But that does make you a little nervous with a lack of solid success against ranked opponents. But with that said, it seems like he appears to be the front runner for that job. Someone a little different from the norm of those 2 options would be Kyle Whittingham, head coach at Utah. Now, if you're not very familiar with the Utah program, then you might not understand why this is a potentially great hire. But you've got the Bear Bryant Award, which he won in 2008. And then he wins the Pac-12 Coach of the Year in 2019. He takes over for Utah, goes 13-0 in 2008 in his 5th year with the program. They finish as the number 2 team in the country. And you think, well, they were a Mountain West team, so what do I really care about Utah? Well, they beat Alabama in the Sugar Bowl to finish as the 2nd-ranked team in the country. So they were a legit team in 2013. Transfer over to the Pac-12, and a bit of a rough transition his first few years. But he wins 10 games in 2015, 9 in 2018. Best year since switching over to the Pac-12 between 2011 and now was definitely 2019 when they won 11 games, finished 16th, had one of the top defenses in the country. So very different from the previous guys I talked about, right? Like James Franklin, Luke Fickell, guys a little younger. Kyle Whittingham, very strong defensive coach, able to succeed with what he's given at Utah. And you got to remember, the guy's 135 and 67 and 11-3 in bowl games. 11-3. The guy's phenomenal. Now, can he go from a program like Utah to USC and compete? We'll see. You know what I mean? But he's got Pac-12 ties. He knows the area. Originally from the state of California. And I think it'd be a solid hire. Now, do I think this is someone they want to fight the next 10 or 15 years with? Maybe not. But if they want to take Kyle Whittingham from Utah, bring him over to USC, shape their culture, fix the program, and develop a different identity from what they've had, Kyle Whittingham is a really good option. I don't think it's the most likely, but I do think it would be a good hire, a safe hire. And finally, with my 4th head coach candidate, this would be an attempt from USC to sort of challenge Texas, to mirror what Texas has done. Because Clay Helton did fine, as did, Tom Herman at Texas. But Texas wanted to go out and get the best head coaching candidate with the most potential on the market at the time, and that was Steve Sarkisian. USC would do the same thing, going and getting Tony Elliott, the offensive coordinator from the University of Clemson. Tony Elliott has been with Clemson since 2011. He started off as their running back coach. And then in 2015, went over to co-offensive coordinator before taking over as full-time offensive coordinator in 2020. So he did take part in play calls and things like that as the co-offensive coordinator. He won the Broyles Award in 2017 for best assistant coach in the country, which is definitely pretty significant. And while at Clemson, obviously, he's aided in producing some of the best offenses in the country. With quarterbacks like Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence, running backs like Wayne Gallman and Travis Etienne, now Will Shipley, who's there. Wide receivers like Mike Williams and Justin Ross, currently with the program. So he's aided in that development. He knows what elite potential is. He knows how to recruit, and he knows how to call plays. So ultimately, he's a very strong candidate. Now, of course, maybe a negative you point out is, hey, Clemson recruits at a monster level, and he's thrown 5 stars to work with. And that's true. But take, for example, last year's Ohio State game, when he was not able to call plays for the team because of COVID. Their offense was a mess. They most certainly missed his presence there on that game. Very good head coaching candidate. He's going to get hired up by somebody. It's a matter of who. If USC wants to stick to an offensive identity, that's kind of the guy I would think is who they are aiming for. So those are my 4 favorite head coaching candidates to replace Clay Helton at USC. And whoever they hire, it's going to be a big deal. It's like Texas hiring Steve Sarkisian. That's a massive blue blood program, a lot of money to spend, looking to change their culture and get back to their winning ways. So, they're entrusting the next guy to do that. So that's a very big deal. Next up, I got a little segment I want to talk about. Not going to take up too much time. And then after that, we're going to talk about conference realignment. But ridiculous amount of injuries taking place right now across college football. And injuries happen every year, don't get me wrong. But you look at some of these programs. Let's start with Oregon, who today it came out, Justin Flo, 5-star linebacker at a high school, missed last year with injury as well. He's going to be out for all of this season with a foot injury that's going to require surgery. So he's out for the year. So you lose a 5-star at linebacker and someone who was looking to prove that he was worthy of that 5-star ranking in high school. Then you lose Justin Thibodeau, stud defensive end. He's going to be the number 1 or 2 pick in the NFL draft. Best player on their defense. He goes down with an injury last week. Unknown return time because it's a tricky injury. So the coaching staff isn't sure when they're going to bring him back. Now, yeah, they still took down Ohio State last week, but it wasn't because of their defense necessarily. It was more to do with their offense. So Oregon loses 2 studs in their front 7. Offensive weapons going down. Ronnie Bell, best wide receiver for the University of Michigan, goes down with an ACL injury. He's out for the year. Mohamed Ibrahim, running back for Minnesota. He put himself on my radar last year. Phenomenal running back there. He was able to put up 1,100 yards as a freshman, put up 1,000 yards in 2020 with 15 touchdowns. In 2019, everybody was talking about their passing game. But 2020, they got by on the ground. That was the only thing that made them really competitive was their run game. And he got off to an incredible start against Ohio State, 163 yards and 2 touchdowns before going down with injury. Now he's out for the year as well, I believe, with an ACL injury. Quarterbacks, quarterbacks going down with injury. Phil Dracovic, the lifeblood of that Boston College team that I said can really surprise this year. He's going to be out for the season. Haynes King, starting quarterback at Texas A&M, out till mid-October with an injury. JT Daniels, quarterback for Georgia. He injured himself the previous week against Clemson. Had to sit out last week. We'll see when he returns to the field. LSU lost their starting quarterback Miles Brennan before the season started. I talked about that before. So you have just all these injuries going on. And that's not even all of them, you know what I mean? There's still plenty of other guys going down with injury. I'm not trying to ignore those. But these are just some of those real significant ones. And you can kind of tell, this year's already crazy. And now you have injuries taking place. We just had one of the craziest weekends in college football that we've had in a long time. And now you have injuries piling up for teams. Who's going to win that attrition battle over the course of the year? Who's going to stay more healthy to be able to beat out these other teams? That's a really big question. So I really just want to highlight some of those big injuries that are happening. And if it happened for your favorite team, then I apologize. That's very unfortunate. Happened for my Wolverines. Ronnie Bell going down sucked, and I talked about how that might affect them. But with that said, we have another bit of news I want to talk about for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to transition over into talking about some of these weird games that happened over the weekend. And then if you're interested, check out my next video that's coming up quickly about the biggest games from last weekend, and we're going to go over those. But it's conference realignment for the Big 12, which may not be over yet. Now, I'm not sure how impactful these teams will be for the Big 12. They lose their 2 biggest markets, Texas and Oklahoma. absolute money earners. Oklahoma's been their most competitive program on the field. Texas is their biggest earner. In response to the SEC kind of poaching those programs away, the Big 12 adds BYU, Houston, University of Central Florida, and Cincinnati Bearcats. These programs have had varying levels of success recently. We talked about Cincinnati and what Luke Fickell's done for them. Very similar to what Brian Kelly did, actually, back in the late 2000s. A couple of seasons, they finished in the top 25. And then in his third year, he took them to a 12-0 season, and they finished 8th in the country. Luke Fickell, he did that in his fourth year. He's now in year 5 with the program. But in between those two and before Brian Kelly, you've got nothing of significance to really talk about for that program there at Cincinnati. UCF is an interesting one. When George O'Leary, he gave him an 11-win season out of nowhere back in 2010. Next thing you know, they win 12 games in 2013. Scott Frost, he famously took them to 13-0 back in 2017. People talked about, should Cincinnati be a playoff team? Josh Heupel, the year after that, 12 wins. You have a couple New Year's Six Bowl wins in there, but now is Gus Malzahn going to make them a competitive program moving forward? Is he going to be able to hand the program off to somebody else? The program I'm least excited about switching over there, and I understand they wanted to add another Texas team, which effectively this conference revolves around the state of Texas even more than it did before, is Houston. The Houston Cougars, Tom Herman gave them one good season in 2015. They won a Peach Bowl, went 13-1. That was great. Kevin Sumlin, gave them a good 12-win season, but finished 18th, got a ticket to City Bowl. I don't even know what that is. Before that, you got to go back to the 90s. Before that, you got to go back to the early 70s. Houston, just not a whole lot of success for that program on a yearly basis either. And I get it, right? They're not a part of a Power 5 conference. BYU, they've had some good seasons there. BYU's actually been the most consistent out of all these other programs in their history. I'd be interested to see what other moves the Big 12 has planned. The Big 12 right now really looks like a Frankenstein conference. It centers around the state of Texas, but you go out to Florida, you go out west to BYU. It's a really weird conference right now, and I don't know how they're going to expect to compete with the other Power 5 conferences when they don't have any blue bloods attached to their name. Pac-12 hasn't been particularly successful in the field, but Oregon is becoming an iconic program. USC is a blue blood. The Big Ten's got Ohio State, Penn State, Wisconsin. Teams that have been successful on the field in very big brands. The SEC, dominant on the field. ACC is at least led by Clemson. So the Big 12 is definitely in a tricky situation. We'll see who really is going to follow Big 12 football. That's kind of my big question, is who's really going to follow Big 12 football? And who's going to step up in this conference? Who's going to become the head dog or two? I would think that some more entrenched programs like TCU or Texas Tech might be able to step up now that the likes of Texas and Oklahoma will be gone in the near future, possibly in 2 or 3 years. And not having to wait until 2025. That was kind of the big thing, is will they have to wait till 2025, 2026? Can they make this move done in a year or two? So we're waiting on that result, but definitely an interesting move. Let's see how it works out. If you are a Big 12 fan or a fan of these programs, what's the general consensus on the current status of the Big 12? What's the overall vibe? Who do people think is going to step up? Right now, it looks like Iowa State, right? But when Matt Campbell leaves Iowa State, what's going to happen there? I don't know. So let's move on to the next and final part of the episode. I'm going to talk about some of these absolutely crazy games that happened last weekend. As I said, going to knock these out, kind of throw some bits of information out there. And then in my next shorter episode, we're going to go over those big dog games that were played. Now, I've got 5 games I want to talk about, and I've bracketed them down a little bit. My first 2 are close calls. So these were the close call games from the weekend where you had a couple of big top 10 programs nearly get upset. You had 8th ranked Notre Dame facing Toledo. This was at home for Notre Dame. Now, remember, Notre Dame struggled last week against Florida State. That game went into overtime, and Florida State lined up for a field goal to end that. Now, they, of course, the Seminoles missed the field goal, and Notre Dame went on to win the game. But Jack Cohn did not have as strong a performance like the previous week. He had 2 touchdowns and a pick on the game. The run game wasn't particularly effective. They averaged 3.4 yards a carry. Granted, Kyron Williams, Tyler Buckner, when he stepped in, actually did all right leading the way for them. But really the problem for me here is just somehow they allowed Toledo to hang in this until the end. I mean, they were all over the quarterback. They registered 5 sacks on the day and multiple quarterback hurries. But at the end of the first, it was 7-6. And then at the end of the second, it was 14-16, Toledo's lead. Scoreless third quarter, it came all down to the fourth. Notre Dame is no longer a top 10 team. I thought after struggling against Florida State, they shouldn't be viewed a top 10 team. Now that they've struggled 2 weeks in a row against inferior competition, down to the wire games, only winning by 3 in both, Notre Dame is lucky to be in the top 15 for me. And then Texas A&M is an interesting one. Texas A&M at Colorado, Haynes King goes down with an injury, like I said, after throwing 2 passes, and Zach Calzada has to step in. Well, the offense absolutely shut down at that point, never got their footing. Their run game was abysmal, 29 for 97 and 3.3 yards a carry. Now, Colorado didn't have a whole lot going for them either, but their run game was a little better. Unfortunately for them, they had absolutely 0 passing game. Brendan Lewis, 13 for 25 and 89 yards and a pick. But the thing about Texas A&M is they had no run game, and their defense had very few splash plays. They only got 1 sack on the quarterback, plenty of passes defended, but no real splash play, I felt like, by the defense to change the tide of this game. You know what I mean? Texas A&M had 1 offensive score, and that was in the 4th quarter of the game. They were losing almost the entire football game. And they were heavily penalized, 7 penalties for 65 yards. So Texas A&M's a little bit of trouble. They looked messy. Their offense couldn't get it together. Thankfully, their defense did keep Colorado down, but I think that's more at the fault of Colorado's offense than Texas A&M's defense. So they were viewed coming into the season as a potential Alabama killer if they can figure out the quarterback position. Now that Haynes King is hurt, I don't know if Calzada can step in and fill that role effectively enough. He looked very rattled against Colorado. He was all over the place. So that was definitely concerning for an A&M fan. Let's move over to that other Texas program, Texas at Arkansas. Now, I expected Texas to split their first 2 games. Thought it was going to be week 1 against Louisiana Lafayette, but they do win that game. Walk into Arkansas as the 15th ranked team in the country. And they end up getting dominated at the point of attack. Now, people are talking about this Arkansas game. I actually got into an argument with someone online about the Arkansas game. They said, man, look at the culture Arkansas is breeding there right now. Look what they have going for them. And I agree. But they won 3 games last year, and we're only 2 games into this season. Let's see how the rest of the year goes. A lot of this, for me, fell on Texas. Now, I understand Texas has the better athletes. They're better recruited. But they got a first-year head coach that I'm not crazy about anyway. And Hudson Card looked like a freshman quarterback out there. He was 8 for 15 for 61 yards. They bring Casey Thompson out there, throws the ball 8 times. Almost all his damage was done on the ground. He had almost as many rushing yards as he did passing yards. He had 57 passing yards and 44 rushing yards. He gave Texas 2 rushing touchdowns, but the thing is, the game ended on a score of 40-21, but Texas scored 14 points in the 4th quarter. That game was absolutely done. So they were going into the 4th quarter, ended the 3rd, 7-33. That's insane. I mean, Texas was getting destroyed by Arkansas, and Arkansas was doing it all on the ground. They had 138 passing yards and an interception on the game, but they had multiple running backs running on Texas, and they ended the game 333 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns. And they were efficient too, 7 yards a carry. And Texas wasn't able to get a single sack on the quarterback. That to me is very impressive. Now, granted, they didn't throw the ball all that much, but still, they were able to throw the ball when it mattered, convert third downs, have a couple big plays, and Arkansas took care of business. And I loved it. You know, people were whispering, man, is Texas going to drop this football game? And they sure did. Personally, I don't think I like that they replaced Hudson Card. He is a freshman quarterback. Now, this must mean that they were divided on the quarterback position. Steve Sarkisian must not be totally sure what he wants at quarterback. Because when a freshman quarterback looks like a freshman, you can't be too surprised and opt to bench him. That's my personal opinion. They went with Casey Thompson, and I've said before in a previous video, I think Texas is probably going to disappoint some people this year. They may have made a slam dunk hire at head coach. We're not sure yet. I think they're going to disappoint people this year, and it starts with this Arkansas game. So that kicks off my upsets. So 15th ranked Texas gets upset on the road by Arkansas. Of course, the game kind of everybody's probably wanted to talk about is, of course, Jacksonville State going on the road to beat the Florida State Seminoles. But with that, Mike Norvell is probably the next coach up to get fired himself. And Florida State suffers an absolutely embarrassing loss. And it's not like Florida State has high expectations or anything for the year, but you don't lose to Jacksonville State in your own stadium. Come on, guys. So there's another massive upset there in the form of Jacksonville State. But the game that got Clay Helton fired, Stanford at USC, game played in SoCal, and the 14th ranked Trojans get beat down 28-42. And that's another game that really wasn't as close because at the end of the first half, the game was 21-10. At the end of the third quarter, it was 35-13. So it really was a dominant performance by Stanford. Really a balanced performance by Stanford. Nathaniel Pete, only 6 carries, but 115 yards and a score. No other significant rusher there on the ground. They didn't really run a whole lot. Austin Jones, very inefficient running the ball. But Tanner McGee, he did everything he had to do. 16 for 23, 234 and 2. Just a solid game. Caden Slavis has fallen off for USC. He went from being this freshman phenom, to throwing 223 and a touchdown and a pick against Stanford. Their run game actually wasn't bad, but it wasn't a big contributor for them. And ultimately, their defense wasn't able to get to the quarterback. So, Clay Helton, his days are over and done at USC. So this is definitely going to affect recruiting. I would expect to at least see a few recruits bounce around the Pac-12 and some other conferences that USC is going to lose. But we'll see who they hire at head coach. So there's another big upset there with 14th ranked USC. Probably came into the year overhyped, I will say. Definitely a little overrated. So if you were upset about Notre Dame being overhyped coming into the year, you should have been upset about USC being overrated coming into the season. But with that said, thank you for listening, everybody. Some news, some notes, some games to talk about. Just wanted to get that out there for you guys. Hear my opinion on those. Check out my next episode. I'll let you know. Going to be talking about that Michigan game. Talking about Ohio State. We're going to be talking Iowa State. Those biggest games from the weekend in what was an absolutely nutty weekend. Tons of upsets. Tons of surprises. I mean, really a lot to break down. That was a wild weekend of college football. And with that, check out my next episode tomorrow. And thanks for listening, everybody.